my own perspective is that if we want to create capabilities, we need to focus on the provision of basic goods and services.
Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Drayton Discourse, brought to you by the Economist Society here at UCL. My name is Vandarika.
And I'm Yash, and we're thrilled today to be joined by American public policy expert, Professor Kenneth Reinert. Professor Reinert directs the International Commerce and Policy Program at George Mason University. His research covers a wide array of topics ranging from globalization to development economics.
He has worked extensively on the basic goods approach, an alternate way to measure human progress, and his book No Small Hope is based on this research. He is also the author of The Introduction to International Economics, a textbook used by students all over the world. Professor Reinert has also made his mark on the policymaking stage by consulting for the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the OECD.
He has also held the position of Senior International Economist at the U.S. International Trade Commission. So without further ado, let's straight get to the interview. So, Professor, thank you so much for joining us for an episode of the Drayton Discourse. And we would just like to start the discussion discussing the current scenario, which is the COVID-19 pandemic and its implications on international trade. So the first question that our audience would be interested in is that, in your opinion, what impact is the pandemic having on international trade and organizations like the WTO?
Well, the pandemic is a very broad-based downturn in the world economy. We can envision it as broad-based declines in GDP across the world, and this is by nature of that event going to have a negative impact on international trade. But it's also helpful to think about this as impacting specific supply chains because there are localized aspects to COVID-19 and there are local places in the world that are having to shut down, and supply chains are very widely distributed right now. So we're also working with a scenario where supply chains are being interrupted, and this is having specific impacts on specific goods and services. There are sectors such as air travel that are by their nature not well adaptable to the presence of COVID-19. So there will be also specific sectors that relate to, such as in that case, trade and services, that will be adversely affected. But this is combined with a period of time in which the World Trade Organization is, in a sense, and I don't think I'm exaggerating too much here, under attack politically by the current administration in the United States. So the US government's posture towards the World Trade Organization, as with all multilateral endeavors, is quite negative. We now have a essentially interrupted dispute settlement process at the WTO because the appellate body is not fully staffed. And that is as a result of US actions at the WTO. So we have perhaps what I would argue is the most robust dispute settlement system internationally being undermined by the US government. We are approaching, as you know, a decision about the new DG for the WTO, and the US posture towards that process seems quite negative as well, with threats to use a veto if there's any quote unquote anti-American posture by any of the potential DGs. And anti-American is a loose term, particularly with regard to trade policy. I, as a US citizen, might be anti-American in the eyes of the current US administration if you call into question any of the policies that are being pursued right now. I very recently wrote an editorial entitled "The United States Needs the World Trade Organization." Yeah. And I think that is the case. The WTO was largely designed by the United States for the United States. And that was true at the beginning. It was true in the Uruguay round with the General Agreement on Trade and Services and the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. Those are US inventions. And so it's very strange that we have the confluence of the pandemic and an administration in the United States which is backing out of the WTO process, even though the process was designed by and for it.
Thank you very much for that answer. And following on the topic of international trade, in 2019, the French President Macron expressed his opposition towards a trade agreement between the EU and the Mercosur on the basis that the latter would not respect the Paris Agreement. But ultimately, the deal was made. Yes. And as an expert on Latin American economics, as yourself, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, putting on my trade policy hat, I have a bias towards multilateral approaches to trade policy, and these preferential trade agreements for trade economists are very much a second best approach to trade liberalization. So we need to think about Mercosur in itself and EU-Mercosur in that context. This is a second best approach. It's a regional or preferential trade agreement. It's not, at the multilateral level. Having said that, we need to keep in mind that this is, in the language of the summer of 2019, an agreement in principle. And there are, quite extensive draft texts on this, but they're not completely final. And the EU-Mercosur agreement has been in negotiation for 2 decades now. So we're quite far along, but we may not be all the way there. I think Mercosur's looking towards the European Union makes more sense than looking towards the United States, given patterns of trade and investment. We can recall that Argentina in the past, late 90s, very early 2000s, had a currency board arrangement for their currency, which was, quote unquote, irrevocably linked to the US dollar on a one-to-one parity. At that time, international economists thought that was very strange because the trade and investment ties with the United States were less profound than with the European Union. So I think this is a recognition that the European Union does matter. I don't think this is a panacea for Mercosur and the countries involved. Particularly Brazil and Argentina now are going through some profound crises. And if this is ever finalized, it could be helpful, but it's not the thing that will help these two countries that are facing economic and in the case of Brazil, severe COVID-19 crises.
Thank you so much for your insight. And moving the discussion from international trade to development economics, because you obviously specialize in development economics as well. So 2 approaches essentially prevail in development economics, when it's taught at the university level at least. So one is obviously the standard growth perspective, which is that, growth fixes things automatically. Yes. It's the Kuznets curve, essentially. And the second is the capabilities approach, pioneered by Amartya Sen, which is that, you should treat humans as end in themselves, and growth doesn't necessarily flatten things out. Yes. So we have obviously studied the intricacies and the of these 2 approaches, but what, in your opinion, are the limitations of these perspectives?
The first thing we need to recognize is that growth matters. And Amartya Sen will say that growth matters. But it has some limitations. Defining GDP in and of itself is part art and part science. So what is actually being measured, particularly in areas like financial services, is not always clear. We have growth theory, we have new growth theory. We know that capital deepening matters, we know that institutions matter, we know that openness matters, human capital. But translating this into enhancing growth is difficult. We don't quite know how to make growth happen. It's one thing to say, oh, institutions matter, good institutions are important, but achieving that is an entirely different matter in and of itself. So, you know, it's not like we can turn a switch on and say, okay, we need more growth. It's a much more complicated process. And the truth is that it often doesn't happen. You know, we have countries where it does, you know, take place. Some of them are not clearly countries with good institutions. Some of them are communist dictatorships, which don't come to the, you know, top of the pile as, you know, good institutional approach to economic development. So there are limits to the growth approach. The capabilities approach was very helpful in that it expanded our scope of consideration. So we began to look at education. We began, most importantly, to look at health. But the capabilities approach is very aspirational. It's where we ultimately would like to get. And what I have tried to do in my own work is to search for a middle ground, particularly since these two communities don't get on along very well in policy realms, and to focus on how we actually can create capabilities. You mentioned Amartya Sen, but there's also Martha Nussbaum from the University of Chicago. If you read her book, Creating Capabilities, there's not actually a lot in there on how we create capabilities. And my own perspective is that if we want to create capabilities, we need to focus on the provision of basic goods and services. And along the way, if you look at the empirical literature in economics, most of those basic goods and services support growth processes. They would enhance growth prospects. So what I've tried to do is to find a middle ground between these two communities. The most important thing about growth is it provides basic goods and services that meet basic needs. These basic goods and services in turn tend to support growth, and they help us create capabilities. If you look at the capabilities research, they downplay the role of basic goods and services. They use a term that comes from Marx, commodity fetishism, that's not what we need to be focused on. That's commodity fetishism. But then if you keep reading, and I've read, you know, many of these basic works in the capabilities approach, they then invoke them, you know, as material preconditions. And sometimes things like sanitation or education are couched in terms of capabilities, which they are not by their own definition. So there's a lot of confusion in that literature. Basic goods and services are not capabilities, but they very much support capabilities. As you've seen, I also have a recent piece in Ethics and International Affairs, which looks at the Sustainable Development Goals, all 169 of those targets, which relates to the aspirational notion of capabilities. and suggests that we need to pare those down radically. And I proposed 10 basic development goals and defended them as a way of starting to think about a more narrow agenda. And I think a narrow agenda in the middle of COVID-19 is very helpful. We're not in a position where we can be thinking about growth prospects. Those are not going to come back for a while. We are going to have a lot of backsliding on capabilities and the Sustainable Development Goals. So why not look at a restricted agenda for the time being, focused on basic needs and the delivery of basic goods and services. Could I add one more thing to that?
Sure.
If you look at the literature on economic and social rights and that whole realm of research and practice, you'll see that most economic and social rights within the UN system are defined in terms of basic goods and services. They are by and large not defined in terms of growth. They're not defined in terms of capabilities. So there's a link from the basic goods approach to basic economic and social rights.
Well, thank you so much for that, this extensive answer, but very interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, sorry.
So our following question was actually about the basic goods approach in economic development that you came up with, but I suppose you've already answered that.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. That's totally fine. So if my colleague is all right with this, we might move on to the next question.
Sure. So we can talk about, so you mentioned growth as well, right? And growth being an important determining factor. But recently, growth itself has come under heavy scrutiny, regarding being an economic ideal, especially GDP growth. And this is when issues of sustainability come in. So, and you yourself have mentioned, I read the beginning of your book, like what was available on the internet, and you mentioned that, growth can lead to the proliferation of food and medicine, which are basic goods, as well as something like cigarettes and weaponry, which is something that hit us pretty hard. So according to you, what are some of the ways that countries can harness growth and direct it towards funding basic goods and services?
Okay, that is a difficult question, but one would need to go country by country. One would need to look at if there is growth and the extent to which that growth is translating into the broad-based provision of basic goods and services. And if that is not the case, then there is something wrong, because that is the advertisement for growth. It provides us more food and medicines. That's why we need to have it. It has an anti-poverty impact. But if that's not occurring, something is getting in the way. And it might simply be that the increased incomes are filtering through systems of corruption to, elites in the society. It might be that it's filtering into a lot of imports of luxury goods. It might be that there is an underinvestment in education and sanitation systems and the like, that it's really a question of public investment. You mentioned that Bill Easterly was part of this series, and he has a chapter in a book by Danny Roderick on Pakistan entitled Growth Without Development. If you have growth without development, you need to start looking very carefully at that particular case. But at that level, you need to be going, through country case studies. More broadly, there is potentially an argument for safety nets that need to be put in place. There potentially could be an argument for some sort of universal basic income system, conditional cash transfers that I talk about in that book. But this would all need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, well, thank you for this answer. And so at this point of the interview, we'd like to focus the discussion on you and your career more specifically. So you are a professor of public policy.
Yes.
But you're also an expert in both international and development economics. So how did you find yourself at the junction of these fields, and what are some of the challenges and advantages of working in this intersection?
It was interesting that you posed this question because I actually hadn't thought about it. I just tend to, go out to the next project and just follow my interests. But my PhD is in international economics. My dissertation was in trade theory, but I applied trade theory to agricultural pricing issues in low and middle income countries. And these were both theoretical models and an applied model. And so this, particularly in a model applied to the Asian context and one to the Central American context, got me thinking about the links between trade patterns and development patterns. And this is not unique to me. This is, a field of trade and development in international economics. So I began there when I was working for the U.S. International Trade Commission. I was modeling NAFTA, and that obviously includes Mexico, which has a lot of interesting development issues. So I got a touch of that along the way in looking at NAFTA. But as a result of writing the textbook in international economics, I was invited to work on a project at the World Bank, a book entitled Globalization for Development. And this was a project I did with Ian Golden, who's now at the Martin School at Oxford. And this looked at aspects of economic globalization in detail and their links to development. So that also got me thinking about this overlap. Meanwhile, I was teaching a development class with some frequency and learning more and more about the capabilities approach and health and education, and looking at the empirical literature on those topics. And this led me to think about development itself, which led to the No Small Hope book on basic goods provision. I wanted to clarify for myself what I really thought about outcomes assessment in development and what mattered, so I could communicate that in the classroom to have a perspective. It's not necessarily, it's a popular perspective with the students, but it may not be a popular perspective in policy communities that tend to downplay the role of basic goods and services.
Thank you for your answer. And you are also a university program director, and you particularly direct international commerce and policy. And you must have attended or seen quite a few batches graduate under you. So what is your main piece of advice for some of our graduating students?
I direct a master's program. I previously taught undergrads in a liberal arts context. It's Masters of International Commerce and Policy at the Schar School of Policy and Government. So we have a lot of students interested in both private sector opportunities and those interested in public sector opportunities, international organizations, NGOs, and the like. And we've been through some, challenging years, with regard to labor markets and job prospects. So the one thing I try to communicate to students is, first of all, don't give up. It can take a while. I've had students who, have spent a year looking for the job that they wanted. Good students. And it's important not to give up, not to get discouraged, because most of these individuals do find something that is quite meaningful to them. It may take a little while. Okay, so that's my first message. Don't give up. The second is in terms of your own, career trajectory, is to think about small wins. You may not, land your dream job, but if you are progressing slowly, if you're getting active in professional associations, you might need to make a lateral move, to something similar, but not quite what you want. As long as you're ratcheting up slowly and, scoring these small wins, you're on a path. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind and not to get discouraged, because, I have, been in this business for quite some time. And if you look at the trajectories of students, in any one year, it might not look positive, but over a course of, many years, students are doing incredible things. And they're progressing in very interesting and productive ways. So don't give up. That's my main message.
Well, thank you for that piece of advice. I'm sure I'll keep in mind your kind words and motivating words as well. So now to conclude the interview, we'd like to take you through a thought experiment.
Yes.
So there have been a lot of iconic and defining meetings which have somewhat determined the course of economics as a subject, such as, for example, Bretton Woods or the Paris Climate Agreement.
Yes.
So if you could be present at one such conference and give a speech, which meeting would you want to attend and what would your speech be about?
The choice of meeting for me is very easy. That would be the Bretton Woods conference. I've been to the Bretton Woods Hotel. I grew up in New England. And off to my left here in this home office is Robert Skidelsky's 3-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes, and the 3rd volume goes through the Bretton Woods Conference. I think it was an extraordinary event. And I would, give anything to be a fly on the wall at that meeting. It was one of those rare times when many, representatives of many different governments, in the last dying days of World War II came together and tried to do something multilaterally. To be honest, I wouldn't want to make a speech at I want to just listen, but if I was forced to, and that's what you're, forcing me to think about, I would say something about the extraordinary nature of the event, how important it is that it's a multilateral effort. I would try to communicate that, and even at that time, that sort of thing was very rare. I would also admonish the participants to think more about international trade. Out of the Bretton Woods Conference, we got the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which slowly morphed into the World Bank Group. But notions at that time of an international trade organization were not high on the agenda at that meeting. They were put off for the future. And the hoped for ITO did not occur. We had just an agreement, general agreement on trade, tariffs and trade, but no organization. And so I think it would have been important to focus more on trade issues at that meeting. The experience of World War I and World War II were ones in which there were dramatic downturns in trade relations among countries. And so that should have been placed more highly on the Bretton Woods agenda.